Last time, I survived 300 days with the Create mod in hardcore Minecraft, and the factory was really starting to take shape, but as always, there was still so much left to do. Plus, you all seem to really want to see more yet again, so this time, I survived 400 days with the Create mod in hardcore Minecraft. Be sure to like and subscribe if you guys enjoy the video. Starting out, I had a huge project in mind, so on day 301, I looked around the base for a large area to start building in. It seemed like I was running out of room, so I decided I was finally going to have to clear out that stupidly annoying pocket of water that had already caused me so many problems in the prior days. I crafted up tons and tons of create blocks that I was planning on using to make an overly complicated, but still admittedly awesome contraption to drain all the water while I really just went and binge watched the new season of Stranger Things. And not that I typically have to say this, but come on guys, no spoilers in the comments. Day 302 and 303 were also both admittedly kind of boring crafting days as I continued making more and more create blocks. At this point, I was trying to decide if this was all just a huge mistake or not, but honestly, I was too deep already, so I just pressed on and finished crafting all the blocks as I neared the end of the day. This would all be worth it, right? As day 303 came to an end, I started building a small platform on the side of the pool of water where I would build my extreme Drain-O-Matic. There's some other name that isn't totally stupid. The next day, I built out over the center of the pool and placed down 3 hose pulleys so I could suck up the water at least a decent rate. I connected pumps to each pulley and then ran pipes all the way back to the platform where I built a very basic 3x3x4 fluid tank where all the water would be temporarily stored before I voided it. I then placed cogwheels between each pump to eventually bring power to them and started building the water voiding contraption. I placed down a 3x3 of linear chassis, made them all sticky, and then placed down a 3x3 layer of deployers directly below them. I had to break some of the large fluid tank to actually get under the contraption to continue building it because obviously I didn't think this through very well, but I set each of the deployers to filter the actual fluid tank, and then I placed down a layer of drills below the deployers and rotated them to face down. And with that, the mechanical part of the contraption was actually done, if you can imagine, and I finally finished off day 304 by placing down the 2 layers of the fluid tank that I had to get rid of earlier. Now that I had the mechanical part done, I spent day 305 working on the automation of the contraption. I cleared out the area above the linear chassis and placed down a chest for the fluid tanks to be stored in, along with a rope pulley to raise and lower the contraption. I placed down a sequence gear shift on the side of the pulley to control the direction of rotation using a redstone signal, and then cleared out a bit more space above the contraption just so it'd be a little bit easier to work. I realized I was going to need some rotation speed controllers, which expectedly, I forgot to craft, so I went to the precision mechanism assembly and put in 2 gold sheets to be processed. Once both precision mechanisms were done being processed, I grabbed them out of the chest, crafted them into rotation speed controllers, and ran all the way back over to the contraption to continue building. I extended the rotational power from the gear shift back into the wall, connected it to the rotation speed controller, and then I hooked that up to a water wheel. Definitely not the fanciest setup, but at the end of the day, I got the water wheel situated with some soul sand and 2 buckets of water, and then I cranked the rotation speed controller all the way up to 80 RPM. To start off day 306, I accessed the sequence gear shift and set it to lower the contraption 37 blocks, and then raise it 3 blocks whenever the gear shift got a redstone signal. I placed a redstone link on the gear shift, set it to receive signals, and put its frequency to fluid tanks. I put down a comparator coming out of the large fluid tank on the lower platform and sent the signal into a pulse repeater and then a pulse extender before having it go into another redstone link. I set the frequency of that redstone link to match the one on top of the contraption, adjusted the timing of the pulse extender to 1 second, and finally changed the comparator to subtract mode. At this point, I was getting pretty tired of all the redstone, but there was still 1 step left to do, so I crafted an analog lever and placed it down running into the comparator with the signal strength set to 14. With all the automation finally complete, the last piece of the puzzle was to power the pumps, so on day 307, I ran the rotational power from the hose pulleys back to the platform and cleared out another area in the wall to set up a lot of water wheels with a rotation speed controller. I could have used a lot of other methods to power this, but it seemed appropriate to use water wheels to drain the water. I'm not sure if that's super stupid or super smart, but here we are. Once I had the water wheels ready to go, I cranked up the rotation speed controller all the way to 128 RPM and used a hand crank to lower each of the hose pulleys just a few blocks down into the water. I double checked to make sure that both the water was draining and the tank was filling up, and after confirming both, I just had to sit and wait for the tank to completely fill up to verify then that the voiding contraption actually worked. Right when the tank was completely filled, the contraption lowered, breaking the top 3 layers of the tank and immediately placing them back down. I was ecstatic the setup worked perfectly after 7 whole days of building it. I definitely might have been able to clear out the water faster using some different method, but this was without a doubt the coolest way possible. Days 308 through 310 were really just spent sitting watching the setup run like a well-oiled machine. Unfortunately, I couldn't fully AFK because I had to keep lowering the hose pulleys every few minutes, but it wasn't all that bad because I did in fact actually get to watch Stranger Things. And for those of you who are curious, I had to keep lowering the hose pulleys because they only register the pool of water from the hose location and up. So to prevent it from treating the pool like an infinite water source, I had to keep the area it registered under 10,000 source blocks. Honestly, the entire process was extremely satisfying to watch, and by the end of day 310, the entire area of water was drained and ready to be terraformed. Day 311 started with me tearing down the entire contraption that I just used to drain all the water. I'm gonna be honest with you guys, this was absolutely heartbreaking because I loved how it looked and how it ran, but it no longer served a purpose, so with a heavy heart, I shift right-clicked everything to death using my wrench. I had to make a few trips back and forth to the storage area since my inventory was becoming quite a mess with all the create blocks, but eventually I had destroyed the entire contraption and was ready to start filling in the area. I managed to get a single layer of deep slate down before day 311 came to an end, which really scared me for how long the entire process was going to take. Much like the previous day, day 312 was spent filling in the huge hole with even more deep slate. Layer by layer, I slowly filled in the area, and as the amount of deep slate I placed increased, my will to live decreased. I had to make a quick trip over to the minecart unloading area to grab more deep slate, as I was pretty much burning through my supply, but once I stocked back up, I got right back into the block placing groove. I had made a pretty solid amount of progress and decided to finish off the day by shaving off a few outer layers from the top of the area just so that I wouldn't have to build up so high to meet it. Can anyone guess what I did on day 313? Correct! I kept working on filling in the stupid area that I was starting to despise with every fiber of my being. I figured the fastest way to fill it in would actually be to continue shaving off outer layers from the top so I wouldn't have to build up so much, so I pretty much just did that. Unfortunately, it did make a bit of a mess, dropping blocks all over the rest of the base and even into belt systems of the machines that I had below me, so eventually I had to go down and clear it all out. I cleaned out my inventory in the storage room, restocked on deep slate, and got back to filling in the area for the rest of the day. Day 314 was a virtual carbon copy of day 313, so in order to not bore y'all to death like this project was doing to me, here are the spark notes. I filled in a bit more, got lazy and started lowering the walls again to avoid doing more work, and lowering the walls made a mess and clogged up nearly every machine below it, so I went and unclogged them and chucked everything in the automated storage system that for some reason I hadn't made a dump chest for yet and was still manually using. By day 315, I had enough of the terraforming gig and decided to say screw it and just work with what was there. I now had the area I needed for my next big project, so I started crafting up tons and tons of cauldrons. I crafted so many, I actually ran out of iron, so I took all the iron from the beacon, replaced it with gold now that the gold generator had run long enough, and then used the iron blocks I just took to finish making the 81 cauldrons that I would need. I grabbed a bunch of different styles of deep slate blocks and ended up using the deep slate tiles to outline a 9x9 area where I would put the cauldrons. I forgot I was going to need a lot of pipes for this project, so before putting anything else down, I ran back and crafted a bunch of the pipes to go under each cauldron. Once everything was ready to go, I filled in the first layer of the 9x9 completely with pipes, and then filled in the 9x9 area above those pipes with cauldrons. I lined the deep slate tiles around the pipes with slabs and called it a day. If you couldn't already guess, the cauldrons were actually for collecting lava for a lava generator and eventually an andesite generator too. Unfortunately, I also needed dripstone for this setup and didn't really have any lying around, so day 316 was dedicated to collecting at least 81 dripstone. I definitely got a bit distracted and did more actual mining than I needed to during this trip, but in the end I did manage to get plenty of dripstone so I could both set up the actual lava generator and decorate the area around it at least a little bit. I returned from my small mining trip on day 317 with a full inventory, so I unloaded all the ore I mined into the ore processing setup. While I was watching everything process for a minute, I noticed the gold generator had stopped running, so I ran over to do a little bit of troubleshooting. It took me an embarrassingly long time to find out where the actual connection had broken, and it ended up being a random shaft that was running underground. To this day, I still have no idea why it broke, but in the moment I just replaced it, reconnected everything, and after that it seemed like the gold generator was back up and running at full capacity as usual. On day 318, it was time to start working on the lava generator, so I started clearing out the wall around the cauldrons and replacing everything with cobbled deep slate. I tried my best to keep the natural texture to the wall instead of just making it completely flat, and once the walls were done, I started working on the ceiling. I wanted the ceiling directly above the cauldrons to be a lot lower so the dripstone dripping into them would look a little bit better, but it was definitely a painful process to actually make that happen. I used a mess of deep slate scaffolding to build above the cauldrons and attempted to give the new ceiling at least a little bit of character. At the end of the day, I stood back to admire my work and, well, it was definitely something. Suffice to say it would need a little bit more work, but at least it was a start. Day 319 was a pretty chill day that I used to blend the massive deep slate that I had just made during the prior day in a little bit better with the surrounding area. I started out by working on the walls, but pretty quickly decided my time was better spent trying to make the massive deep slate cube that was hovering over the cauldrons look a little bit more natural. Yet again, I pillared up with a mess of deep slate scaffolding and slowly but surely built out the ceiling so it was a little bit more gradually transitioned from the area where the dripstone would go to the actual natural ceiling of the cave. With the shaping of the ceiling and surrounding area mostly done, I started out day 320 by replacing majority of the deep slate directly over the cauldrons with dripstone blocks. I figured the dripstone would look a lot better if it was on an appropriately colored block, so I kept the same shape that I initially designed, but I made the entire 9x9 area dripstone blocks. Once the entire area was ready to go, I started placing down all 81 pointed dripstone I would need to effectively make use of every single cauldron. Once the first 81 were placed down, I had a fair bit left over and just kind of went around randomly adding a few pointed dripstone here and there just to make it seem a little bit more random and natural looking. On day 321, I went down into the mine to start hauling lava all the way back up to the surface. I was going to need 81 buckets of lava total since I need a source block over every single piece of dripstone to generate lava in the cauldron below it. I filled up majority of my inventory and then went back up to the base to start unloading every single bucket. Before I could actually place down all the lava I just got, I had to clear out the 9x9 area above the dripstone blocks so I could actually fill it in with lava, so I spent a fair bit of time digging out that entire area. With the area cleared out, I finished off the day by placing down a bucket of lava and checking that the pointed dripstone had switched from the typical water drops to lava drops, and then I grabbed some glass to cover the lava with so I didn't have a little bit of an accident and just kinda die. Day 322 and 323 really just consisted of me making trips back and forth from the mine to the lava generator. Bucket by bucket, I painstakingly filled in the area above the lava generator and then covered each layer in glass as I filled it in. Thankfully, as I was finishing it up and breaking the scaffolding to come down, I could see that lots of the cauldrons had already filled with lava, giving me some hope that the setup would actually be pretty darn efficient. Now that the lava generation was taken care of, I had to use day 324 to generate some rotational power and actually pull all the lava from the cauldrons. I placed down a few water wheels and turned them into magma wheels since I felt thematically it would look a little bit better, even though they would generate a fair bit less stress capacity and run at a lower RPM. I then hooked up some pipes coming out from under the cauldrons and put a pump down that should be able to pump lava from every single cauldron. I spent more time than I'm proud to admit connecting the rotational power from the magma wheels to a rotation speed controller and then to the pump, but eventually I got it all working and cranked up the speed to max. Just to double check that everything was working, I placed down a single tank and let it fill up with lava. Once I knew that everything was good to go, I placed down a 3x3x4 tank that would store all the lava and then hooked it up to the system to start filling up. Before the day ended, I also ran some quick tests just by placing lava in the furthest cauldrons from the pump to make sure it could still pump from them, and after seeing it was able to, I was happy to say that the lava generator was finally finished. Day 325 was yet another laid-back building day as I went around the lava generator and continued to try to blend in the area a bit more. I placed more dripstone blocks down to blend the 9x9 area of dripstone in a bit more naturally, and also added in a lot more cobbled deep slate just around the entire area. As per usual, the area was not complete though without copious amounts of moss blocks, so I snagged some moss from my secret stash and started placing blocks wherever I could just to add in some color to the otherwise kind of bland landscape. With the lava generator fully operational, it was time to put that lava to good use, so I spent most of day 326 crafting up everything I would need to make the andesite generator. It was definitely going to take a hefty time investment to get up and running, but in the end it should save me a lot of time. Once I finished crafting the copious amount of blocks, I went up to the lava generator and built off the tank with some pipes and ran them into the basin where andesite would eventually be crafted. I finished off the day by slapping down a mechanical press over the basin and then sat back to try and actually plan out how the heck I was going to make this mess of a contraption. Days 327 and 328 were contraption assembly days. I started out by running a belt under the basin and put an andesite funnel down to input the items into it. I extended the belt slightly and then ran another 3 belts perpendicular to the first one so they could all dump items onto the final belt that was running into the basin. I placed down 2 millstones on 2 of the 3 adjacent belts to generate flint from gravel. I also placed down another millstone a few blocks back from the 3 belts to convert cobblestone to gravel, then cleared out the area behind it and ran yet another belt under that millstone. I slapped down an andesite funnel on one side of the new millstone for an input, and then a brass funnel on the other side to filter the outputs, and also slapped down brass funnels to filter the outputs on the other 2 millstones that I was using to generate flint. I placed down 3 brass tunnels on the 3 adjacent belts and set them to forced round robin, so for every 3 gravel coming out of that first millstone, the final basin would get 1 gravel and 2 flint. Finally, I set up a very basic cobblestone generator dumping onto the belt using some mechanical drills, water, and lava. To finish off day 328, I cleared out an area behind the cobblestone generator and placed down a few magma wheels to eventually power the entire system. Over the next 2 days, I completed the painful process of connecting all the rotational power for the system. There were so many moving parts in such a small area that it took ages of trial and error to get everything spinning in the correct direction and at the correct speed. I even had to add in another magma wheel because apparently 4 wasn't enough to run the system even at relatively slow speeds. Once everything was properly hooked up and running, I placed down a chest right after the basin and put an andesite funnel on it to collect my now infinite supply of andesite. Along with finishing off the andesite generator, I also placed down a spout and a depot that I could use to fill buckets with lava from the fluid tank without having to go all the way down into the mine. With that, I figured everything was done, but before day 330 ended, I noticed a backup at the cobblestone generator and spent the rest of the day adjusting the rotational power yet again to slow down the cobblestone generator and speed up the millstone, turning it into gravel. I spent days 331 to 333 doing even more terraforming of the area around the newly finished andesite generator. The shape of the generator was a little bit wacky, so I kinda wanted to contour the wall to match it so it looked a little bit less out of place. I mapped out where I wanted the back wall to actually sit behind the generator, and then just slowly built up layer by layer with cobbled deep slate, trying to blend it in with the actual wall. Once I finished filling in the new wall, I got rid of majority of the stone in the area around it, and also replaced that with cobbled deep slate. Much like I did with the lava generator, I attempted to keep the natural shape of the cave when replacing the already existing wall, which made it take a little bit longer, but at least I think in the end was well worth it. After I finished blending in the right side of the andesite generator area with the lava generator area, I went over and pretty much did the exact same thing for the other side of the andesite generator too. I decided that the cobblestone generator looked a little bit out of place, so I built a large chunk of cobbled deep slate down from the ceiling to sort of envelop it and make it look like it was actually built into the cave wall. Once I finished with the general boring block swapping, I grabbed some fancy deep slate blocks and ended up placing a layer of polished deep slate lining the lava generator, along with placing down lots and lots of patches of moss everywhere I could. After doing a ton of building for the first 33 days, my pickaxe was running a bit low on durability, so on day 334, I grabbed some wood and went to trade for emeralds and XP with the Fletcher on the surface. Unfortunately, and pretty typical for me, it appears that my dirt box for my villagers was kind of insufficient protection, and they had both been bitten by a zombie and were now zombie villagers. I went back down into the base and had to actually look up the recipe for potions of weakness since I quite literally have never used them before. Thankfully, I had nearly everything I would need to make it. I grabbed a spider eye from the chest along with a piece of gunpowder and some apples to make golden apples, and then broke a few pieces of sugarcane to eventually turn into sugar. The last piece of the puzzle was a brown mushroom. Stupid, useless, brown mushroom. I like to call the next 3 days Rage and the Brown Mushroom, a tale of a YouTuber who lost his frickin' mind. Since I never use brown mushrooms for quite literally anything, I had no idea how to even find them other than just randomly looking in caves, randomly finding them on the surface, or randomly stumbling across them in the nether. You might be noticing a pattern here. Over the next 3 days, I scoured cave after cave after cave in search of brown mushrooms. Eventually, I got fed up with looking in caves and decided to go to the surface for a bit to look around, and yet again had zero luck finding any semblance of fungal life. At this point, I was convinced I had more fungus in my body from the yogurt I ate this morning or between my toes than I had in my entire stupid Minecraft world. As day 336 ended, I went into the nether with my last-ditch effort of going back to my nether fortress since it was in a nether wastes biome, and the internet never lies and told me brown mushrooms spawn there. It was definitely a long trek and I lost hope for a while, but eventually I found a huge patch of brown mushrooms just chilling right under an overhang next to the nether fortress. I grabbed as many as my grubby little hands could hold and booked it back to the overworld to finally close the book on this awful chapter of my Minecraft career. I'm gonna be honest guys, it's hard to admit when you've hit rock bottom, but I think it's safe to say that this was it. After returning to the base on day 338, I crafted up the fermented spider eye and started brewing up the splash potions of weakness. Once the potions were ready to go, I took the elevator up to the surface, chucked a potion into the dirt pit, and gave both villagers a golden apple. I wasn't really sure how long the process took since, again, I had never done it before, so I kind of just planned to sit and wait. But eventually I realized it might be bad if one changed back first and was locked in with the other and like they could bite each other or something, so I spent some time separating both zombie villagers just to be safe. I already looked like an idiot for the last couple days, I'm not doing it again. The librarian was the first to change back and it took the Fletcher a little bit longer, but by the end of the day both villagers were cured and back to their normal, annoying, lovable noise-making selves. I honestly don't think I've been so happy to see a regular villager in my entire life. After seeing how dangerous it was just to leave the villagers exposed to the elements above ground, I spent days 339 and 340 moving them both down into the cave. I started out by clearing out 2 small holes near the storage room just to kind of stick the villagers in once I got them down into the cave, and then went back to the surface to start the arduous process of actually moving them. I eventually got both villagers trapped in their own boats so that I could paddle them all the way over to the elevator and decided to move the librarian first. I had to trap them in a dirt cage outside the elevator and just kind of wait for them to wander in since the boat couldn't actually fit in it, but thankfully they went in pretty quickly. I hopped in the elevator with them and we took a quick ride down into the cave together. Once I got down into the cave, I trapped them in the boat again and went back to do the exact same thing with the Fletcher. After successfully moving the Fletcher down into the cave as well, I paddled the librarian as close as I could to the hole that I wanted them to live in. Unfortunately, I couldn't paddle them up the steps, so I just kind of had to trap them in this messy dirt area again and wait for them to wander into the hole before I trapped them in there with their lectern. I was not going to make the same mistake twice, so for the Fletcher, I made a one wide path to move the boat on so I could get them right to the hole, and it worked perfectly. I trapped the Fletcher in with the fletching table and then cleaned up the mess I made around the entire base. Now that I had the villagers trapped in the cave, I decided I should give them a decent looking place to live, so I grabbed a bunch of building blocks and got to work. It honestly took a fair bit of time before I finally got to a point where I was happy with the design of the area, but I went for sort of like a trading outpost look and felt like I accomplished that goal pretty well. Although I was definitely happy with the overall design, I felt like it needed a little bit more detail, so I added in some lanterns here and some barrels there, just to give it a bit more character with some decorations. I also blended in the roof of the trading area with the ceiling by building up above the villagers to make it look like the roof was actually supporting some of the natural cave wall. I added in some glowberries and then made 2 name tags to give the villagers. It was definitely a tough decision if Shals or Donnie got to be the librarian, since neither one of them really seemed to fit the bill, but I ended up settling on Shals as the librarian and Donnie as the Fletcher. I'm not sure if either one's going to be mad about that or not, so why don't we just not tell them? On day 343, I wanted to start working on an automated mixing setup, so I went over to the gold generator and tore down the bones of the setup that I had tried to make at the end of last episode. I had a new plan that was going to be even bigger and even better than the one I tried to do before. Once I had collected all the blocks, I went up past the lava and andesite generators to the last remaining area to build in for the time being, and just kind of started clearing out some extra space and laying down a few layers of cobbled deep slate so I could build on it. Over the next 4 days, I worked to assemble the wickedly overkill mixing setup. I placed down the 4 basins next to each other with a depot on one end, and then put mechanical mixers over each basin and a mechanical press over the depot. I ran a line of belts under each of those 5 machines to carry items in and out, and placed down a line of brass tunnels on the back of those belts to filter what went to each specific machine from one single input. I set filters for each tunnel, with the first 2 being zinc and copper to make brass, the 3rd and 4th being andesite and iron nuggets to make andesite alloy, and the final one being gold, iron, and brass to make different kinds of sheets. I set the tunnels to forced split so that every input would be evenly divided among the outputs, and then put brass funnels to input up to a stack of items to each basin and depot. I ran a single belt line into the brass tunnel for item input, and then ran another belt from that out in front of the mixers for even more item input. I had to make a quick trip to the Nether to fill up some blaze burners for the brass mixing, since I honestly completely forgot I even needed them, but it was a pretty quick trip, and before I knew it, I was back to building. I put down a chest for item input with a brass funnel outputting onto the belt, and then put andesite funnels on each of the chests the basin and depot would output to. I had to redo the belts under the brass basins so I could actually fit the blaze burner under each, otherwise they wouldn't even work, but honestly it wasn't too much of a problem. I also placed down a depot and set it as the input for a mechanical arm with both blaze burners as the outputs, and then placed down the mechanical arm so it could automatically fuel both blaze burners whenever they needed it. With the main part of the mechanical setup done, I had to power it, so on days 348 and 349, I started out by setting up a massive line of water wheels that would hopefully be sufficient to power everything at a relatively high RPM. I ran all the water wheels directly into a rotation speed controller so that I could just crank up the RPM as high as possible, and then spent a very long time trying to connect everything in a not totally disgusting manner. Eventually, my worst fear came true and the entire system got overstressed, so I did have to add in more water wheels, but by the end of day 349, it was time to test run the system. I tossed some fuel into the input chest along with some copper and zinc, and pretty quickly found out I would have to implement some limits on how much of each item was sent out, as the system got backed up almost immediately and didn't even work. Since I didn't have a solution just yet, I kind of manually removed the backup for the time being to let the system run, and aside from that small, not actually small hiccup, it actually worked. Or at least the brass did. For some reason that I still don't understand, when I did the andesite alloy, the mixer just wouldn't mix no matter what I did, and I'm at a loss, so I resigned for the day and just kind of decided to fix it later. On day 350, I finally got the andesite production working simply by breaking and replacing the basins. I honestly have no clue why it worked, but it did, so I'm not complaining. With everything now working, the last problem I had to deal with was the overloading issue. So I planned to use some semi-complex redstone setup to control when the items were sent and how many items were sent specifically to avoid this. This unfortunately meant a lot of crafting had to be done, so the entirety of days 350 and 351 were spent running around the base crafting up various redstone blocks to make the magic happen. After finishing up all my crafting, I took just a small detour on day 352 to do some trading with the villagers and kill some zombies to get level 30 so I could enchant a new piece of sandpaper. I got Unbreaking 3, which is honestly the best that I could hope for, and would eventually put some mending on it so I'd never run out of sandpaper again. It ain't much, but it's honest work. Days 353 to 356 were spent making the semi-complicated redstone automation for the mixing setup. I started out by extending the input belt, lowering it by 1 block, and putting 5 smart chutes down to eventually drop items onto it. I put 5 individual chests down, 1 for each chute, and then put a stockpile switch behind each of these chests just to read its contents. I put down redstone links on the back of each stockpile switch so I'd be able to enable or disable the system based on if every block in the recipe was present or not. I also mined out the area behind the smart chutes and placed redstone links on each of those as well, and then set all of them to receiving so I could enable or disable the inputting of items into the system. I set some basic frequencies for the redstone links and then cleared out a very large area behind the mixers so I could start setting up the redstone logic. I did a bit of trial and error at the start by placing down the redstone links for both brass ingredients along with a powered latch, but realized I would need a reset signal to come from the basin when it was finished processing to reset the logic. I had a hard time figuring out where to actually put a stockpile switch for the basin, so eventually I removed the mechanical arm and placed it there along with a redstone link. Once I had everything ready to go, I tore down my prior redstone that honestly never would have worked and started setting up a new, improved version. I made an AND gate using the zinc and copper stockpile switch links, and then ran that signal into a powered latch that would be reset using the basin stockpile switch signal. I adjusted the chest stockpile switches to turn on when at least 32 items were in them, and then set the chutes to only drop 32 items at a time, since it was the max amount the system could process at any given interval. With that, I did a final trial run, and to my amazement, it worked perfectly. With the brass redstone done, I spent day 357 crafting up everything I would need to duplicate that same exact setup for andesite, since I ended up using nearly everything I had crafted starting out. Thankfully, I knew exactly what I needed, and by the end of the day, my inventory was full of fancy redstone gadgets, and it was time to get back to building. Days 358 and 359 were spent duplicating the exact same redstone setup for the andesite alloy mixers instead of the brass ones. I'm going to spare you guys the long-winded explanation again since we just went over it, and honestly, my voice is like dying after that, but in summary, I made the exact same overly complex AND gate with the exact same timing for each redstone piece, but I just used the appropriate frequencies for each, and after doing the initial trial run with plenty of andesite and iron nuggets, it seemed to also work perfectly. There was a lot less trial and error needed the second time around, thankfully. To finish off day 359, I placed down the mechanical arm, but this time set up a redstone on-off switch to only allow the arm to get power when the basin was full, just so it didn't waste fuel randomly. I did a few more brass trial runs just to verify it worked, and after seeing it functioning perfectly, I was ecstatic. This was by far and away one of the most complex logic-based setups I have ever made with Create. With the entire system automated and honestly working flawlessly, I needed a bit of a mental break, so I spent the next 5 days just completely transforming the mixing area. I started out by working on improving the water wheel area by lining the outside with deep slate bricks, and then adding in some stripped spruce wood on the sides. I wasn't really sure what to do with the ceiling above the water wheels, and I guess it really didn't matter much, so I just added in a mix of cobbled deep slate and some moss, and I actually felt like it turned out pretty nice. Once I had the area cleaned up, I also blended in the top of the water wheel housing with the ceiling so there wasn't this big gross gap anymore, and I replaced a fair bit of the stone around it with cobbled deep slate and moss. With that area done, it was time to turn my attention to the mixing area, and I ended up using pretty much the same exact block style because honestly, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Plus, honestly, I'm not that creative at all, as you guys have seen, so once I found something that works, I'm sticking with it. I used deep slate bricks, stripped spruce, and lots of cobbled deep slate and moss to spruce up the area. That was horrible. And then I went and added in some deep slate tile slabs around the entire build. I filled in some of the open areas with random cobbled deep slate and moss and covered the back of the mixing area with polished andesite just so the mess of redstone wouldn't actually be visible. To finish off the area, I added in some barrels, lanterns, and glowberries, which really seemed to tie everything together. You all told me you wanted me to get a bit more creative with how I designed my builds, so hopefully this kind of fits the bill because I was thrilled with how it turned out in the end. On day 365, I decided it was time to make an official staircase going from the mixing area to the lava generator and andesite generator. I spent a fair bit of time trying to build out a rough shape of a curved staircase using both full blocks of cobbled deep slate and slabs so I could just run straight up it. Once I was sufficiently happy with both how it looked and how it actually felt to go up and down it, I lined both sides with polished deep slate just to make it a little bit more noticeable, and then put down some lanterns as small decorations. The next day, I was already so in the zone on building that I just wanted to keep improving the area, so I did a bit more work on the mixing area by adding in some more moss to the ceiling and putting down some more glowberries to help light up the area with pretty much anything other than torches. To officially finish off the area, I made some item frames and put one on each input and output chest just to show what would be in each. While the output chest didn't really need this and it was just more for detail, the frames were pretty critical on the input chests since each chest was very specific with which items needed to go in it, and the system would pretty much just break if the wrong items got into the wrong chests. With everything finally complete from the mechanics to the redstone and the design, I slapped some items in the input chest and just sat back and watched the beautiful system run and save me countless hours of tedious work. Days 367 and 368 were dedicated to all you guys in the comments complaining that I don't use bone meal enough. Unfortunately, nobody really wanted to listen to me when I said I didn't have any bone meal to even use until I did the wither skeleton farming at the end of last episode, so it seemed the only logical fix was to make a bone meal generator. I dug under the belt from the wheat farm where I was dumping seeds and made sort of a janky hopper chain just to carry the seeds from the farm and the wheat processing to a composter to turn them into bone meal. I covered the hoppers up, and although it wouldn't be all that fast, all the bone meal would end up in a barrel at the staircase by the tree farm. I took all the bones from when I killed way too many wither skeletons and tossed them in the ore processing setup to convert them into bone meal as efficiently as possible. The only downside of this was it also made way too much white dye, which I was never going to use, and both would clog up the ore processing, so I just sat there and picked up every piece that came out and eventually dumped it all in the barrel. The next day, I wanted to finally finish off my gear, and with the villagers now in the cave, that was a lot easier to do. I started out by trading as many sticks to the Fletcher as I could just to get some emeralds, and then I bought 6 mending books from the librarian, and mainly stopped at 6 because I only had 6 books on me to also trade with. I even went and killed 2 zombies to try to get level 30 for some reason, which didn't even work, and I'm not sure why I wanted level 30 because I wasn't enchanting anything. I started out by enchanting my sandpaper with mending, which ended up breaking the anvil finally, so I quickly made another one, and piece by piece enchanted the rest of my gear with mending except my sword because I was actually 1 book short. On top of that, as I'm sure you all know at this point, I'm more of a hide in a cave kind of guy, not really a go out and fight with my sword kind of guy during these episodes. On day 370, I wanted to get started on a honeyed apple setup, so I went to the surface to find some bees' nests to bring home. I had to run a decent amount to actually get to a plains biome, but managed to pretty easily find 5 bees' nests once I got there by using the slightly overpowered entity tracker on the minimap. I decided the best option was just to wait until it was nighttime and then silk touch the nests after the bees went back inside, so I could move both at the same time and just easily get them back to the base. While I was killing time, I ran around and killed a few animals, and eventually it was nighttime. I ran from waypoint to waypoint, picking up each bee's nest that I had marked once the bees were back inside, and then slept the second that I picked up the last one. I spent the start of day 371 running back to the base with an inventory full of bee nests and flowers ready to be set up in the base. After returning home, I put the bee nests in a chest by where I wanted to make the setup, but after going to grab some cobbled deep slate from the nearby chest, I noticed I was finally running really low. Clearly, the only solution to this problem was to grab back out the tunnel bore and let it go for another round, mainly just to gather building blocks. I mean, I guess if it came across a few diamonds, that would be cool too, but quite honestly, I had more uses for cobbled deep slate at this point. I headed down into the mine with all the necessary blocks, cleared out a pretty large area to place down the tunnel bore, changed the deployer filters to cobbled deep slate, and by the end of day 371, it was ready to go. Over the next 3 days, the tunnel bore slowly mined through the deep slate, with me just kinda chilling on the back, enjoying the ride and placing down torches every so often. While there wasn't really much for me to do, I definitely got excited getting to just sit back and watch as diamond ore would pass by. Even though, again, I didn't need more diamonds, I still loved getting them for some reason. By the end of day 374, I felt the bore would have gotten plenty of cobbled deep slate and picked up the entire thing with a wrench so I could start heading home. On day 375, as I ran back to the base, I mined all the ore that the tunnel bore had exposed but couldn't actually get. This ended up being a pretty surprising amount of ore, and eventually, more surprisingly, a lot of it was diamond ore, which was not the experience that I had the other times I used the tunnel bore at the same exact Y level. It took a while to collect all the exposed ore, but eventually I had cleared it all out and made it back to the base. Over the next 5 days, I worked on a project that you all had asked for, which was an automatic tunnel bore unloader. I honestly should have done this a really long time ago, but oh well, there's no time like the present. I started out by tearing down all the chests that were on the wall and clearing out more room at the far end of the unloading area. After expanding the tracks that the tunnel bore would actually sit on, I moved the cart assembler forward just a little bit and then placed down the tunnel bore to see where everything would be situated. The position seemed pretty good to me, so I broke one of the chests on the bore and replaced it with a portable storage interface, and then put another one down on the wall 1 block away from it so the contraption would be able to connect and drop off the items. I fiddled with the belt setup for a while, but eventually just settled on having a single belt running 1 block below the portable storage interface. I put down a brass funnel to pull items from the interface onto the belt, and then put down a bunch of chests below the belt and smart chutes to filter and put items from the belt into each one of those chests. In the end, I shortened the belt by 1 and removed the final chest so that the last smart chute would just be a garbage dump of all the blocks that I really didn't care to save. I set up some basic filters for each of the smart chutes, with the initial ones being for things like cobbled deep slate and andesite, and then the remaining ones covering the various ore outputs. I connected a water wheel to a rotation speed controller, and then hooked that up to the belt so I could run it at whatever speed I wanted, just so the unloading process didn't take all that long. When I did the first trial run, no blocks actually got sorted, which quite honestly made no sense to me because the chutes should have worked perfectly, and after a lot of fiddling with stuff, just breaking and replacing the belt actually fixed the issue. I manually moved stuff back into the tunnel bore just so I could do a second trial run, and that time, it worked flawlessly. On day 381, I grabbed all the ore that I had mined and that the tunnel bore collected, and then tossed them all into the ore processing setup. I also noticed that the storage system seemed to be getting backed up, so I tried to do a quick temporary fix just by grabbing a bunch of spruce logs and bringing them over to the power plant to be smelted down to charcoal, and then also removing random junk out of the non-filtered chests like minecarts, which somehow made their way into the system. I moved all those random blocks like minecarts and rails and cart assemblers that I still don't know how they got in there, into a chest by the new tunnel bore unloading area, and made a note that I'd have to come back later and deal with the storage area issue, since apparently I was making way too many automated setups that worked way too well, and it was just overflowing everything. Day 382 was dedicated to yet again trying to make the new build look at least a little bit nicer. With an inventory full of building blocks, I started clearing out the area around the tunnel bore unloader, and then lined the outside of it with deep slate tiles, while using deep slate bricks and deep slate brick walls to make pillars at either end. I filled in the ceiling and back of the area with polished andesite just to break up all the black that was going on, and then put in some barrels and lanterns to add in a bit more detail and color. If you couldn't tell from them being in pretty much every build so far, I am a huge fan of barrels and lanterns, especially with the current color scheme going on in the cave. I added in some more moss and cobbled deep slate just to blend in the ceiling better, and then added in some cobbled deep slate slabs leading up to the unloading area. I finished everything off by adding in some glowberries and bone mealing them for a bit more light. Now that I was fully stocked up on building blocks again, I spent days 383 and 384 clearing out the area directly behind the unloading area for the eventual honeyed apple setup. I started out by digging a really small cave in the wall and then slowly expanded that, since I thought it would actually be pretty cool to have the bees reside in a small mini cave decorated specifically for them inside the actual cave. I tried to give the cave a natural shape and add in some height variation to both the floor and the ceiling, just so it didn't look too boring, and after 2 days of clearing out blocks and shaping the walls, the area actually looked pretty suitable to fit 5 bee nests without looking totally stupid. I spent the next 2 days finishing off the area so the bees could finally be placed inside. I started out by placing down moss blocks for a majority of the flooring, and then putting cobbled deep slate in areas where I wanted pools of water. I chose to use moss blocks mainly because the grass color in the taiga biome is just disgusting, and I really wanted to keep the vibrant green look for the bee area. Once the flooring was done, I replaced all the blocks on the walls with cobbled deep slate, and then did the same for the ceiling while trying to work in at least a few patches of moss, just so I could hang some glowberries inside because, again, I do love me some glowberries. Once I had replaced all the blocks, I bone mealed the moss on the ground just to add in some natural foliage, and then went around the area randomly placing down flowers so the bees could pollinate. I added in pools of water around the room and eventually made some small areas of flowing water just for even more detail. Finally, I grabbed some glass and closed off the mini cave with a wall of glass that was flush with the regular cave wall. In the end, I loved how this looked and was finally able to put down a door and put all 5 bee nests inside. Day 387 was a crafting day to prepare for the honeyed apple setup. I was going to need a lot of pipes and pumps and tanks, so I started out by going to the mixing setup and pressing a bunch of copper into copper sheets, and then crafting 2 stacks of pipes, a few pumps, and numerous tanks, which were super annoying because they each required barrels. I also got some cogwheels and gearboxes to connect the rotational power, and finally a spout to cover the apples in honey, a depot for them to sit on while the spout worked, and a weighted ejector to toss the apples from the tree farm to the depot to then get covered in honey. I spent the next 4 days assembling the setup to collect the honey automatically and then cover the apples in it. I started out by running a few pipes down from the bottom of each of the 5 bee nests and then cleared out a space outside the bee enclosure and placed down a 3x3x4 tank to store the honey in. Once I knew where the piping had to go, I dug a series of tunnels under the enclosure to connect all 5 pipes together and tried at least my best to streamline it as much as I could, so I'd only need 1 pump to be able to sufficiently pull from even the farthest bee nest. Once all the piping was done and run back to the storage tank, I pulled rotational power from the windmill next to the bread factory and geared it up before eventually connecting it to the pump. Right away, honey started filling up the storage tank, which meant I could move on to the next step of the process. I cleared out another area to place down the depot and spout and made sure it lined up with the apple output from the tree farm so I could launch apples directly onto it. I ran piping from the storage tank to the spout and used the same rotational power to also power a second pump pulling honey from the tank to the spout. I then spent a very long time setting up the weighted ejector so it fired a stack of apples at a time from the tree farm over to the depot to be covered in honey. In the end, I had to use 1 depot to catch the apples and then a hopper to put them on a second depot where the spout would cover them with honey because the spout block itself didn't allow the apples to be thrown directly onto the main depot. After the first successful honeyed apple production, I added in a small belt to carry the honeyed apples into a barrel once they had been covered. I added in some extra decorative blocks around the area and used a brass funnel to filter only honeyed apples from the depot, and then a basic andesite funnel to input into the barrel. With that, the honeyed apple production was complete, and I was so happy with how this entire section of the cave was looking. Now that the honeyed apples were being made, I spent the next 3 days dealing with the storage room issue that I only really kinda curtailed earlier on. I went to each of the unfiltered chests and attempted to set some sort of item filter for them, no matter how dumb it might be. And trust me, it definitely got dumb towards the end. I added in new chests for each of the automated farms such as bone meal and honeyed apples, along with ones for blocks from the nether and even passive and hostile mob drops. Eventually, I had set filters for nearly every single chest, so I went to the end of the belt system and added in a garbage chute with a filter for every single block I had an automated farm for that seemed to be overflowing. This included things like bread, logs, saplings, sticks, and sand, which seemed to be the main cause of the problem, so this would just destroy them if their respective chests were already full. Once this was ready to go, I spent ages clearing out every chest that had a new filter on it, and either just dumping the junk onto the belt to be destroyed eventually, or moving it to the new correct chest that it should be in. After 3 days of very hard and very tedious work, I had fixed the issue and only had 2 chests without filters set, but I'm sure I'd eventually be able to come up with something for them in the future. Probably. On days 395 and 396, I was really out of big projects to work on, but noticed I was running low on zinc and also wanted to try out the unloader again, so I grabbed the tunnel bore and went down into the mine to set it up. Thankfully, because I had just run one, I didn't have to clear out another big area, so it was really quick to set up and get going before I just hopped on the back as usual to be the lazy torch placer. Maybe someday I could automate this every few blocks as well, and then just truly go AFK while it worked. After letting the tunnel bore run a little bit less than usual, I figured it had enough in it to stress test the unloader, so I picked it back up on day 397, mined all the exposed ore on the way back, and then placed down the tunnel bore on the unloader and watched the magic happen. Everything worked perfectly, including excess cobbled deep slate being voided once both chests were full. To finish off the day, I was able to grab all the ore from the unloader chest, along with the ore in my inventory that I mined, and process it all with the ore processor. While the ore processing was finishing, I noticed the storage area got backed up yet again and went to take a quick look. It turned out even more random blocks like glow ink got into the system and had nowhere to go, so I tried to add in as many random blocks to the filters as I could think to avoid having this happen in the future. I also grabbed out a bunch of sand and smelted it down in the bulk smelter to glass before tossing it all into the new glass chest that I had just set up. Finally, I did some more trading with the villagers for XP and consumed the XP orbs from the ore processing to repair all my tools, and I finally enchanted my sword with mending to round out my entire set of enchanted netherite gear on the end of day 398. On day 399, I decided to grab as much zinc, copper, andesite, and iron nuggets as I could, along with some additional iron and gold to turn into sheets, and I took it all up to the mixing setup. I tossed everything in its respective input chests and just sat back and watched as the beautiful setup ran and produced more brass, andesite alloy, and sheets than I would honestly ever need. Just kidding, I always need more of those, as I'm sure you guys are well aware. And with that, it was day 400. Another 100 days were in the book, and I could not be happier with how everything turned out. Be sure to let me know in the comments which build was your favorite, and more importantly, if you think we should go for 500 days next.